welcome back. Talking more about healthy eating, and we're going to kind of look at some of the carbs specifically and what we need to look at as far as carbs go with diabetes. All right, Caroline, tell us a little bit about this slide.
Okay, all right. So the quantity of carbohydrates is so extremely important. You know, we talked a lot about quality, certainly talking about quantity as the queen. All right. So your registered dietitian nutritionist is going to work with you, and maybe you're another diabetes educator, pump trainer, or your endocrinologist to help you figure out about how many carbohydrates you'll need. So be sure to reference your customized plan for quantity. These out of the box programs don't work as well for most of us. So let's make sure that you've got the right approach. You know, many times you'll see out of the box programs with general rules of thumb for people with diabetes. How many carbs should you eat? This is where we really want to spend time with you and your dietitian. Typically, many of us are also looking to lose a little bit of weight concurrent with control of our blood sugar. And we see that most people benefit from a smaller number than is typically published if weight loss is a concern. If weight loss is not a concern, please do not worry about these numbers and make sure that you're working with your diabetes educator to find the right number for you. We do see that women who are not as active, more sedentary women who might be in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and who are well controlled with blood glucose do a little bit better with weight loss also if they have fewer carbohydrates, maybe 30 or so a meal. Again, check with your provider. For men, it might be more like 45 if they're also in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and much more sedentary. Okay, again, check with your provider because it does vary so much with activity level, age, you know, certainly your health status. What kinds of medications are you on? You know, those of you with insulin or with the tendency to have low blood sugar are not going to want to follow these rules of thumb without talking to your provider. Your muscle mass, are you in the gym? Are you working on it? You know, that is also going to affect the amount of carbohydrates that are going to work well for you for either control of blood sugar, weight management, or weight loss, or both. Okay, so just a quick note on those quantities and how to work with your provider to find your right amount.
Let's go look at some food labels. So how many of you, I can't see your hands, but raise your hand if you look at food labels. Yeah, raise both of them. Absolutely. I double time them. I even go into a grocery store and I read food labels because I know either my clients or my patients may be interested in them, and then I may see a food that they've mentioned before, or I may see a new food and I read food labels. So I am 3 hours in a grocery store usually. I can't stand grocery shopping because of it, but I'm 3 hours just reading every single food label I can find. So food labels are important. Now they are an estimate of what's in there based on the ingredients. They're not always exact. And if you look at Triscuits, for example, Triscuits are 6 usually per serving, but not every single Triscuit are the exact same size. So it is an estimation of what those 6 are going to give you. Now, any difference in it is going to be minute. So you're not going to have to worry about making sure you have the exact same size Triscuits when you look. But look at the food label and let's focus on that. Food labels have changed. What's now added to food labels is a much larger calorie size, so we know what's in that calorie and a more realistic serving size. The first thing that you're going to look at is that serving size. Everything that's down here, all the macronutrients and the nutrients that are listed in their serving size is based on this serving size. So if you double this serving size, you go from 2/3 of a cup up to twice that much, then now you're going to have to look at everything down here needs to double as well. All right, so the first thing that we look at is the serving size. And because we're talking about carbohydrates right now, we're only going to focus on carbohydrates. And if we look at carbohydrates, we see total carbohydrates. And that has a grams, 37 grams for this particular food. And if this came from the FDA, I think that this particular food was mac and cheese, if I'm not mistaken. So just so you know. So for this particular serving size, it's 37 grams. Underneath total carbohydrates, you're going to see dietary fiber and you're going to see total sugars. The new part that's recently added is the added sugars. So this is something that is new so that we understand what added sugars are. So anything that is starchy or that is sugary in that particular food, then that is going to be included in the total carbohydrate. Now, if you don't add these up, you don't add up 4 and 12 and say, well, wait a minute, this should be 16 total carbs. No, because there are some additional starch that's in that is not dietary fiber, that is not sugar, that is included in that 37 grams. Okay, so underneath this, we always like to look at that fiber. Fiber is important. Anything with 3 grams of fiber or more, it's considered a good source of dietary fiber. 3 grams of fiber per serving. So this has 12 grams of sugar. So when we look at sugar, remember that sugar has 4 grams of carbs per teaspoon. That's a teaspoon. So 4 grams of carbs per teaspoon is what's in sugar. So for this particular one, has 12 grams. Now, if it's 4 grams of carbs per teaspoon, you can divide 4 into 12 and say, oh, that's 3 teaspoons of sugar in this one particular serving size. So I might want to stick with that 2/3 of a cup, or possibly even cut it down to a 1/2 of a cup, especially if it's mac and cheese. So this has added sugar. So let's look exactly what is added sugar. Added sugar is anything that is not natural to that particular food. So for this, I don't know what this is, so we're not really sure what this added sugar is. But 2 grams is natural to whatever this food is, and 10 grams are added to it. 10 grams of sugars are added. So if we look at this 10 grams and we look at Chobani, this food label is not this yogurt, just so you know. Now, just want to make sure you understand that. But this is an ingredient list that has some natural sugars in it, and it also has some added sugars. The non-fat yogurt or the non-fat milk, that has a natural sugar called lactose. So that's part of this natural sugar. The strawberries that are added to this, that is a natural sugar, but that cane sugar is added sugar. Fruit pectin is added sugar. Lemon juice concentrate and fruit and vegetable juice concentrate, those are added sugars. So if you look at this particular food label for this particular food, then you're going to find that it has a lot of added sugars in it, plus those natural sugars. And the natural sugars are going to come up here under the total, and then what is added to it is included down here. So this week we know about the added sugars now. We know what they are. The food labels prior to these used to just have total sugars, and we didn't know what was added. We didn't know what was natural to it. Natural sugars are a little bit better than those added sugars. Some natural sugars like honey. Honey is not natural to anything except honey. So anytime honey is added to it, it will be added as a natural sugar. Agave syrup, that's an added sugar. So keep that in mind when you're looking at ingredient list. Though it is a natural sugar, it is not natural to that product, so, or to that particular food. So it is an added sugar to that food.
Julie,
you can see over here. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, should we look at the sugar first, or should we look at carbohydrate? What's the most important thing?
Really, the most important thing is that total carbohydrate, but we want you to really look also. I don't want to say that one is more important than the other, but it is significant to understand what those sugars are and how much sugar is in something. You know, that is because that has going to have a greater effect on the blood glucose levels than the starchy foods, especially if there's a lot of fiber.
So if the total carbohydrates are 37, that's an important thing to look at because the total carbohydrates are important. But you can get a really good sense for the quality of the food if the added sugars are also really high. Julie, sometimes I'll look at a label and I'll say, I'll use kind of a rule of thumb. If somebody's on it, if they're doing their best and they're really trying to really work to achieve a certain goal instead of just maintain, sometimes I'll look at it and I'll say, okay, can we try to get under about 6 grams or so per serving, just as just as a tool to say, okay, well, anything more than that is probably a lot. But that's not necessarily the way everybody does it. What do you do?
At 6 grams of sugar,
Yeah.
well, it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
That's going to be, you're going to be reading every single food label.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be hard to do. Kind of get an idea. You're going to learn when you find, especially those foods that and we want you to have variety in your diet. Please have variety in your diet, but we do want you to keep sugar down, especially added sugars down as much as possible. The American Heart Association says no more than 9 teaspoons per day for men and no more than 6 teaspoons per day for women, or of added sugar, not natural sugars, added sugar. So keeping those down as much as possible is important, and that comes to about 50 grams per day of keeping those down as much as possible. And that's important to do. So you you get an idea of about what you're doing, but keeping it really more to those whole foods as much as possible. Even frozen whole foods are good. Keeping that as much as possible to the unprocessed foods as much as possible is going to help you keep those added sugars down.
Great. Good.
This food label over here, this gives you an idea of what 1 serving is of 1 cup. And then if you were to eat the entire container, which I'm assuming is 2 cups, then it gives you what it is for the entire container as opposed to what it is for 1 serving. So keep that in mind. There are 2 servings per container. So this is the entire container, and then this is just the 1 serving. So a lot of times you're going to see, based on the food label, based on the space they're going to have on their food label, based on what the nutrition facts are, you're going to see what it is for the entire container and what it is per serving. Now, if there are 7 or 8 servings per, you're probably not going to see this. You're probably not going to see what is in the entire container.
Julie, tell us a little bit about those percentages.
The daily value. Daily value is important, but it's based on 2,000 calories per day. It's not based on specifics. You're going to be a little bit more specific if you're going to be individualized and have an individualized amount per day. So it's going to be a little bit different than what you may have. But based on 2,000 calories per day, what this percentage of 20% means, that is based on the recommendations, based on national recommendations or the dietary guidelines for Americans. This 20%, this 20% of this added sugar, this is 20% of the daily value. So this is based on that 2,000 calories, total calories per day. This is 20% of that daily value of what the sugar intake should be for that 2,000 calories per day.
So we know what it means. Should we use this?
If you're taking in 2,000 calories per day, if that is your recommendation, you can. Can you use it for somebody who's taking in 1,500 calories per day? It's going to be a little bit more difficult to look at these. You can look at them and get an idea. And that's what you can use it as. So this saturated fat is 5%. So that's an idea of where you would need to be. You could be. If it's 1,500 calories per day is what your recommendation is, then you could say, okay, a little bit less than that, let's say 3%, then this would be 3% of my 1,500 calories per day. So you can do it, but you remember that yours is going to be individualized, so you can bring it down a little bit if it's lower than 2,000 calories per day.
Thanks, Julie. That helps. Great.
All right,
Mm.
looking at some carbohydrates and how those carbohydrates affect blood sugars. Your body stores, when you eat carbohydrates, they turn to glucose in the body. When you have that glucose in your body stores that glucose for energy. It is your body's primary energy source. Your body will use fat for energy when you're sitting down. No, you're not going to burn a lot of fat by sitting. So let's just get that clear. But your body does use some of the fat for energy when you're at rest. But when you're moving, your body is going to use those carbohydrates and some of the fat for energy at that point. So the carbohydrates do have a greater effect on blood sugar levels, much more so than protein and fat alone. So when we look at carbohydrates, let's say that you're going to have a half of a cup of juice. This is a serving size, a half of a cup. I know most of us have this or more of juice, but this is a serving size. This is 15 grams of carbs. Based on 15 grams of carbs, we have to look at what our blood glucose is and what the time is. So this 15 grams can actually cause blood glucose levels to rise very quickly and drop very quickly if nothing else is with it. So if it's juice alone, blood glucose levels or blood sugar levels are going to rise, and then they're going to drop very quickly.
So in the case of someone who's treating low blood sugar or hypoglycemia, juice is one of the tools that is suggested. Tell us a little bit about how this plays into, or this system plays into juice as a treatment for that.
As a treatment, so if your blood sugar is less than 70, this 15 grams of carbs will actually bring your blood sugars up about 50 points. So kind of keep that in mind. Don't be guzzling. That's over treating. In the hospital that I used to work at, they would have a cup of juice and they would add a couple of packets to sugar to it. So now we're adding even more carbs to that juice and potentially causing extremely high blood sugars afterwards, that over treatment. But I will say this, when your blood sugar drops, you just want to eat. You just want to eat until you feel better. Don't do that.
Yes.
Don't do that. I understand that feeling, but you want to treat it and then wait a little bit and you'll start feeling better very quickly. Wait about 15 minutes and then test blood sugars again. It's called the 15 rule. So with this is going to cause blood sugar rise about 50 points. So if your blood sugars are 300 and you drink that, it's going to cause your blood sugars to rise even higher. So keep that in mind.
Will it also facilitate a crash, just like this goes up and will come down?
That's where the testing the blood sugar 15 minutes later is going to help. So it depends on the medication that you're on too. That's the importance of testing blood sugar levels 15 minutes later. 15 minutes later, if it's over 70, and you're good, you may not need something else, but we do want you to test it again 15 minutes later, just to make sure it's not dropping again. It's not continuing to drop. So yeah, it is a little extra testing, especially for those individuals who are on a medication that can cause hypoglycemia or low blood sugar.
Well, that's great.
All right. Protein. Can protein affect your blood sugars? It depends on what you're eating it with. It depends on what you've had prior to. It depends on your activity level. So it can, but it is not as likely to affect your blood sugar levels as much as carbohydrates are. So keep that in mind. So usually when we're eating a protein, it's only going to affect, and a protein and nothing else, then it's not going to have as much of an effect. It's going to be a little bit more level effect, but it can have a small effect on blood sugar levels. So keep that in mind. Does fat affect your blood sugar levels? Not as much as carbohydrates do. They can have a small effect. So if I were to have a piece of chicken that's been fried, that may have a little bit more of an effect, not as much of one because of the amount of fat that's in it. So it can have a very small effect, but not as much of one. But if I look at the fat in peanuts, let's say I have a quarter of a cup of peanuts, which is about an ounce of peanuts, which has about 7 grams of carbohydrates and 7 grams of fat. So those carbohydrates in it, yes, are going to affect my blood sugar levels, not very much because it's only 7 grams, but that fat can now can cause that the peanuts to not affect my blood sugar levels as much, or cause that carbohydrates to not affect it as much.
Like that.
Now, carbs as far as rice goes, and it depends on the type of rice too. So if you're eating a brown rice, it may not have as dramatic of effect, but most of us don't eat brown rice. Most of us eat white rice, correct? So if we're eating white rice, then that third of a cup, which is 15 grams, that's a third of a cup. That's a serving size. So for that third of a cup of rice, then it's going to cause blood sugars to rise and drop. If you're eating only rice, it's going to cause blood sugars to rise and then drop again. It's not going to cause as quick of a rise, because remember, things that are liquid like the orange juice or the juice that we talked about before, if there's nothing in the stomach, that juice, gravity is going to pull it down and it's going to absorb fairly quickly. Rice, though, has to go through a digestive process. So it is going to rise, but it's just not as quickly as that juice. So you can't use rice, though you see there is a spike in blood sugar levels. It's not going to rise as quickly. So don't use rice to treat a blood sugar level, please. You want that, you have low blood sugar level. You want that blood sugar to come up a little bit quicker when you're feeling pretty bad and that blood sugar is low.
And that's a good thing that you just said too, because so many people will eat something like chocolate to treat blood sugar. But in the last slide, we saw that fat didn't have, a big, was it kind of in the way, So let's say if you're eating something that is a combination of carbohydrate and fat to treat blood sugar, it's not going to give you as much of what you're looking for, which is a little spike in sugar to get it back up to normal. Unless you have something, like a glucose tab or a jelly bean. Okay.
Yeah. And I used to have a lot of patients that would eat peanut butter.
Yeah.
Peanut butter does contain, for 2 tablespoons, 2 of these of peanut butter, it has 7 grams of carbs. But it also has 17 grams of fat. Anywhere from 15 to about 17 grams of fat, depending on the type of peanut butter that you eat. So it is going to have a lot of fat in it, which means that's going to slow the digestion of those carbohydrates. Fat is a slower digesting macronutrient. So it's going to slow the digestion of those carbohydrates. So don't use it. When you have a low blood sugar, you don't want to wait to feel better. You want to feel better quickly. You want to feel better soon. So having those rapid, I hate calling them this, but they're rapid acting carbohydrates. But that's not a term I like to use, but they do affect blood sugar levels much quicker than something that contains fat. So using a Snicker bar to treat a low blood sugar? No, not something that's recommended.
I always like to liken it too to that to the athletes. The athletes are using lots of Gatorade and sugar enhanced beverages to get that sugar up a little bit more so that they can use it and run. And they're doing the same thing, getting a little bit more sugar in the blood very quickly without the fats to block it.
Exactly. Yeah, most athletes in the middle of a competition or in the middle of training, they don't eat fat.
Mm-hmm.
If they've been trained well,
Right.
then if they've been trained on how to eat, they're not going to eat fat in the middle of. They're not going to eat a lot of protein in the middle of, because it does not help at all during that time. They'll eat it afterwards, which is where the benefit is going to come from, but not during. So the same thing, you can have something later on that's got a little bit of fat or protein in it, but to treat that low blood sugar, you need to have nothing but carbohydrates in the form of juice or glucose tabs. All right, so carbs plus protein, and you can see that it's has an effect, just not as much of an effect. And that effect is spread out over a period of time rather than the rapid rise and drop. Things that contain protein, foods that contain protein and foods that contain fat have a slower digestive process, and foods that contain fiber have a slower digestive process. It releases from the stomach a little slower. So it's not going to have as quick of a rise as if it's just carbohydrates only.
So this
So
might be a better meal.
a little bit more level rise.
Yeah, so a better meal, really, right? So that it doesn't spike, and it just gives you the sustained energy. That's a good little curve.
It is. That's a great curve, actually. That's what we would want. Throw some vegetables on that, and that curve isn't going to be even as high because those vegetables contain fiber. So it's not going to be as high. It'll come even a little bit lower.
That's awesome.
All right, carbs plus some fats. This could be a biscuit or French fries. Now, a biscuit that you get from somewhere like Hardee's from a fast food restaurant, or like my grandmother, she made them with lard. So, the best biscuits in the world, let me tell you, but you don't want a lot of them. You want one a year, and that's it. So carbs plus fats. Now it causes blood sugars to rise. This section here is going to be those carbohydrates that are able to make it through to be absorbed fairly quickly. But then you have some carbohydrates because of the fat that are going to be absorbed later on, and then even more carbs that are absorbed later on because of the higher amount of fat that's in it. So you can think of movie popcorn. You can think of pizza in this one. So what you're looking at is sometimes 4 hours later that your blood sugars are continuing to rise 4 hours later because of the amount of fat that's in these types of foods that are really high in fat. I always think of lasagna. I think, I think of Kentucky Fried Chicken that is battered. That chicken is battered. So that means it's battered with flour, which is a carbohydrate. So, but we're talking it's fried, which means now it's also high in fat.
And what will happen is then you get hungry for another meal 4 hours after you have this, but the blood sugar hasn't yet dropped. And so then, and that would be a normal eating cycle, but the sugar's still up. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So these are for special occasions only. I like to say I'll have pizza, and we home make our pizza. So, and we use very thin crust when we do pizza, and we do low-fat cheese when we do pizza, so that we're not, and I don't like a lot of cheese on my pizza. I prefer, vegetables on my pizza. Personally. So my husband likes the fat and he likes a lot of cheese. So usually our pizza is split down the middle. This side is his and this side is mine. Because I really want to watch my blood sugar levels and make sure they're not rising 4 hours later and they're rising appropriately and that I can control them a little bit better. Now this is your plate. So a quarter of your plate should contain your protein, and if you are plant-based, then that protein can also be your starch, or it could also be your vegetable. So your starchy foods can be a whole grain pasta, which that grain is going to contain some protein in it, but it's also going to be your starch. So your whole grain pasta may have anywhere from 4 to 6 grams of protein in it. For your legumes or legumes, depending on who you're talking to. So your legumes can be your vegetables, but they may also be your they may also count as some starchy food because they do have some starch in them, but they may also be your protein. Holy cow.
Getting complicated.
It can be. Half of your plate should come from your vegetables. Half of your plate should be vegetables. A quarter of your plate should really be your protein. This is a balanced plate. This is a well-balanced plate. In the morning, a lot of people don't like vegetables in the morning. You make an omelet you got some vegetables. You can throw your vegetables in your morning time and get some good vegetables in.
Ooh, I like that idea. Ooh.
Now this is a plate, but what's missing from this? Caroline, what do you see that may be missing from this plate?
Well, I see some chicken breasts, it looks like, and that is our predominant protein. And then I see a lot of non-starchy vegetables, and we know that just has a little bit of carb, but not very much. So I would say that we tend to want to have that quarter of the plate as a protein. And for our omnivores, that would be the chicken. If plant-based, of course, has a different plate or a different style. But then there would be the half the plate, which is the non-starchy vegetables. I see that, and that looks good. But I see that we're probably having a huge amount of protein, and I don't see any of our starch or carb in there at all. And so I
I
think
see half of our plate is protein and half of our plate is some vegetables.
yeah, yeah. So we're missing our carbohydrate, and so I would add maybe a little less protein and add a little bit more carbohydrate to that to have a balanced plate. That way we'd have the perfect little curve that we saw earlier with that little graph, so that you have the right amount of blood glucose rise and it lasted a long enough duration to bridge the gap between meals.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
Woo!
Okay, time for another break.
Thanks, Julie.
See you soon.